Good afternoon. As children, we are taught the catchy phrase, "In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue." We are then led to believe that he was the first European to declare the world round, and that he braved many adventures, crossing the Atlantic in the Nina, Pinta, and Santa Maria to discover America and become one of history's greatest heroes. However, much like Santa Claus, when we grow up, we learn the cold, hard truth. Christopher Columbus, despite his travels, was no hero, and the atrocities that he committed against the indigenous peoples of the Caribbean were so horrific that he was imprisoned by his own Spanish government. At this point in history, knowing what we know now, naming a day after Christopher Columbus is akin to naming one after Adolf Hitler. And if that sounds like an extreme comparison, it's only because 500 years of history has whitewashed the truth behind Columbus's legacy. In this speech, I will be talking about the origins of Columbus Day, the myths and truths behind the man himself, and modern steps that are being taken to rename the holiday Indigenous Peoples Day, after a culture that is far more deserving. The origins of Columbus Day center around his arrival to the New World on October 12, 1492. According to History.com, the first celebration was in 1792 by New York's Tammany Hall. And in 1892, President Benjamin Harris held a celebration for what was considered 300 years of American life. However, it was not made a federal holiday until 1937, when President Franklin Roosevelt buckled under intense lobbying from the Knights of Columbus Catholic organization. And herein lies some of the controversy associated with the holiday. It has a double meaning. It is not only meant to celebrate Columbus, but also Italian-American heritage and Catholicism, which is why there is still a modern push to keep the name as it is. In an article for The Guardian, however, Anna Van of the Denver Sons of Italy Lodge testified that in 1992, at the 500-year celebration, the parade was blocked for hours by angry protesters. And the parade was not held again until 2000, where the turnout and numbers were much smaller. The origins of these controversies, like the origins of the holiday, are based upon some of the forgotten facts in history about Christopher Columbus himself. Christopher Columbus did not land in the mainland United States in any of his 4 journeys across the Atlantic. Instead, he landed in Cuba, where he set to enslave all of the trusting native people. This quote is taken from Columbus's personal journal, and it was taken from WashingtonPost.com. Columbus says, "The Indians are so naive and so free with their possessions that no one who has not witnessed them would believe it. They would make fine servants. With 50 men we could subjugate them all and make them do whatever we want. Let us, in the name of the Holy Trinity, go on selling all of the slaves that can be sold." Columbus and his minions would go on to murder over 250,000 natives for gold, as well as butchering women and children like sheep and feeding them living to his hunting dogs. Now, once Christopher Columbus established himself and became the governor of Hispaniola, eventually news of his atrocities got back overseas, and he was put in irons and transported back to Spain to stand trial. Some of these crimes were wasting natural resources, sport hunting the natives, and selling children into sex slavery, the profits of which Columbus pocketed himself. But when he was returned to Spain to stand trial, he was immediately pardoned by his friend and admirer, King Ferdinand, who would go on to fund his 4th and final journey across the Atlantic. Now, with so much, according to an article for US Uncut, Christopher Columbus, despite all of his crimes, was not even the first man to reach the Americas. There is proof that the Chinese and the Vikings under Eric the Red and the ancient Babylonians of 600 BC all reached mainland United States, as well as the indigenous peoples who were already here when Columbus reached Cuba. Their ancestors crossed the Bering Strait from Russia into Alaska 120,000 years before. Now, after all of this public knowledge that we now know about Columbus and the truth behind him, many cities and states have already began changing their holiday name to Indigenous Peoples Day. South Dakota officially changed the name as far back as 1990, and several others have followed suit, such as Berkeley, California, Albuquerque, New Mexico, Portland, Oregon, Minneapolis, and St. Paul, Minnesota, and Seattle, Washington. The Native American groups are at the forefront of this change, and even though their population is now less than 2% of the United States population, according to Huffington Post, their members are moving from reservations into urban areas, which is affecting a more centralized change through the cities. But despite all of this public knowledge, Book Report magazine states that there is still mixed reactions to the name change. As I stated before, the Catholics and Italians see this change as a slight against their heritage, and some southern churches still hold services for Christopher Columbus himself. However, many communities are embracing the change, claiming that Indigenous Peoples Day is the beginning of a greater acceptance of cultural diversity and human rights. So in conclusion, we must not allow 500 plus years of history to whitewash the thievery, torture, rape, murder, genocide, and everything else that Christopher Columbus perpetrated on an entire race of people. As long as we continue teaching our children that catchy rhyme, we will continue a tradition of falsity that has haunted this country for long enough. Renaming Columbus Day as Indigenous Peoples Day erases Christopher Columbus as a national hero and celebrates a culture who were Americans before the name. Renaming this day will not bring justice to the Native Americans who were displaced and destroyed by European settlement, but it will turn our country away from outdated dogma and toward a future of truth, peace, and the acceptance of our fellow human beings. And yes, don't worry, we will still get that day off work. Thank you.